Hello and welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha. I'm your host Anurag Bansal. Today is Friday, the 13th of September, and I have three interesting stories for you. In the first story, I'll talk about why onion prices are rising yet again in India. In the second story, I'll talk about Adani's ambitious plans to capture airports worldwide. And in the third story, I'll talk about India's new EV policy. So let's begin. If you have ever wondered why onions keep making headlines for price hikes, you are not alone. Every now and then, the prices of onions rise and fall significantly, and this becomes a major talking point for both consumers as well as policymakers in the country. And this year is not at all different. Over the last couple of weeks, onion prices have risen dramatically and they have crossed 55 rupees per kg in markets like Delhi and Chandigarh. To give you a point of reference, just last month, the price of onions in these very markets was about 40 rupees per kg. But the question is, why does this happen so often and why does the rising price of onion become such a big deal every time? Let me explain by first telling you why you should care about this in the very first place. Look, increasing onion prices matter because India consumes a massive 13 lakh tons of onions every month. And along with tomatoes, onions is one of the most consumed vegetables in the country. So while onions might seem like just another item on our shopping lists, they are actually a very big deal for the Indian economy. The Consumer Price Index or the CPI measures inflation based on the price of changes of a basket of goods and services. In the CPI, vegetables have a 6% weight, out of which tomato, onion, and potato hold a weightage of 2.2%. So whenever onion prices spike, it does not just affect our household budgets, it also pushes up food inflation in the country. And this obviously has some ripple effects. It forces the government to step in and release buffer stock like it is doing in Delhi and Mumbai right now by selling onions at a discounted price. The government may also sometimes have to tweak export policies by restricting imports or exports to try bringing onion prices back down. But talking specifically about what is going wrong this time around, a major culprit is monsoons. Heavy rains in Maharashtra, which by the way is India's largest onion producing state, have raised concerns over the harvest. If rains continue to remain high, there are chances that this harvest might suffer some damage and onions in storage might also be affected heavily. Another small factor is the lingering effects of unseasonal rains and extreme heat waves that had disastrous effects in food production and supply in the country just 2-3 months ago. Food supply takes time to adjust, especially after a terrible heat wave like the one which we had this year, and that's exactly what we are seeing playing out now. Now, if heavy rains do affect the harvest this time, prices will shoot up a lot for sure. In some key onion markets like Nashik, prices have already started to jump by 20 to 30% because these harvests have been hit very hard. But there's also some good news on the other hand. Maharashtra has hit its sowing target for the monsoon kharif season. However, the issue here is that the distribution of monsoon rains in the key onion growing regions in Maharashtra is still very uneven, which continues to affect production and onion prices. The other challenge that plays into prices is the problem of onion spoilage. In India, statistically speaking, we lose about 20 to 30% of onions just in transport and storage because onions are perishable. Now, whenever supplies are tight, like they are now, this wastage becomes a big factor to push prices even higher. Another big issue is the government's back and forth on onion exports. When onion prices rise, the government usually bans exports to keep more onion in the local market. But as soon as prices start to stabilize, this ban is lifted and onions start flowing out of the country again. Now, this back and forth contributes to the regular price swings we see every now and then. But speaking of the situation currently, there is no ban on onion exports. But if onion prices continue to rise or even stay at the same levels as it is today, the government might have to ban exports once again. So while onion prices might seem like just a kitchen problem to all of us, their ups and downs are pretty much like a window into how India's agriculture and food supply chain is doing overall. Now, moving on to the next story, let me talk about the Adani Group. Now, I have two interesting stories about it. The first story takes us to Kenya, where Adani Group's plans to acquire and operate Nairobi's main airport has hit a big speed bump this week. Look, on Tuesday, hundreds of workers at Kenya's main international airport went on strike to protest the proposed 30-year lease deal between the Kenya government and the Adani Group. The strike has caused major disruptions with delayed flight and stranded passengers. Now, at the heart of this issue is a $1.8 billion investment offer from Adani to lease and operate this particular airport. Now, this deal would give Adani control over Kenya's busiest airport and also a key regional hub. However, aviation workers and unions are concerned about potential job losses and a foreign control of a strategic national asset. There are also questions being raised about the transparency of the bidding process in the first place. Now, by Wednesday evening, this strike had ended after the government gave assurance to workers that they would have veto power over any final agreement. But this episode very clearly illustrates the challenges that Adani today faces as it is pursuing its ambitious international expansion plans. Now, Adani has very rapidly grown its airport portfolio in the very recent years. It now operates 7 major airports in India, and this push into Kenya shows Adani's desire to become a global player in airport management. But as we've seen, entering new markets is not always very smooth. Now let's look at the second story, which is Adani's massive new port projects. Now this one requires some more context, so do bear with me please. Now India has over 200 ports along its 7,500-kilometer coastline. This handles about 1.5 billion tons of cargo every single year. But the catch here is India's port capacity utilization is only at about 60%, and most ports cannot handle the world's largest ships due to depth limitations. Now, this is where Virinium, Adani's ambitious deep water port project in Kerala, comes to the picture. See, this is located near India's southern tip, and the port is perfectly positioned to capture traffic from lucrative international shipping routes. But why does this port matter, you might be wondering? Look, it's all about location, depth, and competition with Sri Lanka's Colombo port. Currently, about 75% of India's transshipped cargo is handled at port outside the country. Of this, Colombo, Singapore and Malaysia handle more than 85%, and Colombo port alone handles 45% of this cargo. Now, this is because many Indian ports are not deep enough to accommodate mega container ships. If this cargo were to be handled in India itself, we could save as much as 1,500 to 2,000 crore rupees every single year. But over here, let me take a small pause and explain to you what transshipment means, because it is key to understanding why this port is actually such a big deal. Now think of it this way. Massive container ships, and I'm talking about vessels the size of several football fields, carry goods across the world's oceans. But these ships are so big that they can only dock at a handful of ports which are deep enough to handle them. And that is where transshipment comes in. Now these huge ships stop at deep ports like Colombo or Singapore and offload their cargo to smaller ships who pick it up and distribute it to other ports in the similar region. Now, Virinium specifically has a natural depth of 20 to 24 meters, which means it can accommodate the world's largest vessels. Now, this can help India really recapitulate billions in economic activity that is currently going to Colombo instead. Now, interestingly, the Adani Group is not just challenging Colombo, they are also investing there. In 2021, the Adani Group signed a deal to develop and run the Western Container Terminal at the port of Colombo. This is a $700 million project where Adani holds a 51% stake, which aims to add more capacity to Colombo's port. Now, this dual strategy of developing Virinium port on one side and investing in Colombo on the other side shows how Adani's ambition to dominate regional shipping is crazy. Now back to Virinium, the project has seen many delays and controversies ever since Adani won the contract back in 2015. But things are now finally moving forward. In June this year, Virinium welcomed its first commercial vessel. Now this milestone marked the beginning of operations at India's first custom-built transshipment port. Now the momentum is building very rapidly. As of September, trial operations at Virinium are in full swing, and this shows the port's growing importance in global maritime trade. The port has already hosted multiple large vessels, including ships with draft up to 16.5 meters, which is some of the deepest ever recorded for ships docking at Indian ports. Now, if you think about it, it is a game changer for India. Virinium's natural depth of about 18 to 20 meters allows it to accommodate the world's largest container ships without extensive dredging. And this depth advantage, along with its proximity to major international shipping routes, means that Virinium can become a major hub in global transshipment very, very soon. The world's largest shipping lines are taking notice, by the way. Mediterranean Shipping Company, which is the global leader in container shipping, has already sent 5 ships to Virinium during these trial operations. There are even reports of ongoing discussions between MSC and Adani about the shipping giant becoming an anchor customer for the port. Adani Port is now planning to invest 1.2 billion US dollars to boost Virinium's capacity, and they're aiming for an eventual annual capacity of 6.2 million TEUs. Talking about Adani Ports in specific, it has become India's largest private port player, and it now handles about 27% of India's total cargo and a massive 46% of the country's container traffic. And that is a remarkable rise from just 14% market share in FY 2015. Adani has gone from operating just 2 ports in 2011 to 14 ports today. And remember, ports are a very, very capital-heavy business. Now remember how I mentioned Adani's investment in Colombo ports? Let me explain that a little bit to you. In November 2023, the US International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, announced a $553 million loan to Colombo West International Terminal. This is a joint venture where Adani holds a 51% stake, with the rest owned by local partners and the Sri Lankan government. Now you might be wondering, why is this American involvement so significant? Look, it's not just about financing a port. This move is also widely seen as a strategic counter to China's growing influence in this region. Let me step back and help you look at the bigger picture. China has been heavily investing in ports across the Indian Ocean as a part of its Belt and Road Initiative. According to a 2021 study by Gateway House, China has varying degrees of involvement in at least 17 ports in the Indian Ocean region. This includes a significant investment in Sri Lanka itself. For instance, China operates the Colombo International Container Terminal with 85% stake. Even more famously, it also holds a 99-year lease on the Hambantota port, which Sri Lanka handed over when it could not repay Chinese loans. So when the US steps in to fund an Adani project in Colombo, it is not just about supporting infrastructure development. It is also a clear signal of America's intent to counter China's maritime expansion in this strategically crucial region. For Adani specifically, this US backing is very significant on multiple levels. First, it provides crucial funding for the $700 million terminal project. But perhaps more importantly, it is also a vote of confidence from the US government in Adani's ability to deliver on a large scale. Now, the timing of this could not be better for India. With Colombo facing congestion issues due to the Red Sea crisis and geopolitical uncertainty, Virinium has an opportunity to establish itself as a major regional hub. If Virinium can attract major carriers and prove its efficiency, it could significantly alter trade flows in the Indian Ocean region. As these projects progress, it will be very fascinating to see how they impact regional trade patterns and whether or not they can succeed in providing an alternative to Chinese-backed port infrastructure in the Indian Ocean region. Now, moving on to the third story of the day, the Indian government recently unveiled the PM E-Drive scheme. Now, this is effectively the FAME 3 policy, but with a new name. Now, this new initiative comes with a substantial budget of 10,900 crore rupees, which is allocated for a 2-year period. Now, I've discussed EV and FAME policy many times in our episodes before. Most recently, I discussed this in our Monday's episode, which was titled Government versus Government on EVs. So in case you missed it, do consider going back and watching it as well. Now back to the story. In 2015, India launched the Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicles, or the FAME scheme, and they allocated 895 crore rupees to boost EV adoption and manufacturing in the country. Now, FAME 2 followed the scheme in 2019 with a much larger budget of about 11,500 crore rupees, which aimed to incentivize the sale of about 15 lakh electric vehicles across various categories. Now, as FAME 2 was ending, the government introduced a temporary scheme called the Electric Mobility Promotion Scheme, or EMPS, with a 500 crore rupees budget until it introduces a new subsidy scheme. Now, interestingly, just before the announcement of PM E-Drive, Union Transport Minister Nitin Gadkari suggested that the era of EV subsidies might be coming to an end. He also said that with increasing demand and production volumes, costs were naturally decreasing, which potentially eliminates the need for government subsidies altogether. Now, Gadkari emphasized India's focus on import substitution of cost effective homegrown EV technologies. He pointed out the already favorable 5% GST on EVs as compared to 28% on petrol and diesel vehicles. Now, given these comments, the introduction of PM e-Drive just a few days later raises some interesting questions. Why has the government chosen to continue with subsidies despite Gadkari's comments? The answer remains very unclear. Let's examine what PM e-Drive hopes to accomplish. First, the weirdest change is that electric cars are no longer eligible for subsidies. It is unclear why. Maybe because even the government feels the same way as Nitin Gadkari that EVs are already cost competitive as compared to petrol and diesel car. Second, in the new scheme, the focus has now shifted towards two-wheelers, three-wheelers, buses, and interestingly, ambulances. Third, the scheme has allocated about 3,600 crores for two-wheelers, three-wheelers, ambulances and trucks with the goal of incentivizing nearly 25 lakh e-two-wheelers and over 3 lakh e-three-wheelers. Fourth, there is a significant emphasis on buses. Almost 4,400 crore rupees have been set aside for almost 14,000 e-buses as a try to push electrification of public transport. Now, it's worth noting here that while FAME 2 was a 5-year program, PM e-Drive is set to run just for 2 years. And that is a very, very aggressive timeline if you think about it. Now, while the specific details of how the PM e-Drive subsidies will work are not clear yet, but let me give you a sense of how subsidies in general impact the total cost of ownership for electric vehicles. Let me take an electric two-wheeler for example. And let's use the data from Ather's very recent IPO filing. Even without subsidies, the TCO or the total cost of ownership of an electric two-wheeler in 2024 was about 37% lower than that of a comparable petrol scooter if you assume an annual usage of about 8,000 kilometers over a 7-year period. Now, with subsidies, this difference has increased to 55%, and these percentages will change with the new PM e-Drive scheme, but my intent was largely to give you a broad idea. Now, it's also important to note that as and when battery technology improves and production scales up, the TCO advantage of electric two-wheelers is expected to increase even without subsidies. An interesting pattern to note is that from FAME 1 to FAME 2, the subsidy amount per vehicle was actually reduced. This shift was from a flat amount to a battery capacity based subsidy with a cap of 40% of the vehicle's cost. But it'll be interesting to see how this new scheme affects these costs. The PM e-Drive scheme addresses a very key problem from the previous programs. Under the new scheme, buyers will receive an Aadhaar authenticated e-voucher at the time of purchase, which will clearly show the subsidy amount. This will ensure that end users are fully aware of the government's contribution to reducing the vehicle's cost, which will create a clearer trail of subsidy distribution. Now, the introduction of PM e-Drive is very important as a movement in India's electric vehicle journey. By allocating substantial funds to specific vehicle categories and charging infrastructure, the government is clearly betting on a targeted approach to accelerate EV adoption. But this new scheme also raises some very important questions. First, will the 2-year timeframe be enough to create lasting change in India's transportation landscape? Second, how will the exclusion of electric cars from subsidies impact the broader EV market? Only time will tell as we watch this policy unfold. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you found value in this episode. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and goodbye.